Yeah. So I think we'll just get started. Uh, John is now with who are you with, John? Econ uh,
Economic Restoration
yeah,
Services.
yeah, Economic Restoration Services. I know John from when he was an owner back with AloTerra, and now John has moved on to looking at more economy scale stuff, and he's here to talk to us about ecosystems as models for restoring our economies.
Great.
So are you, John?
Thanks. Let me see. I can pull up my shared screen, right?
Yep.
See how this works. Can you all see this okay?
Yep. Yep.
All right, I'm going to expand this to presenter mode. There we go. This. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Ken. This work, I've relabeled this a little bit to build on last week's session on awe, and to relabel this the poetry of our economy, nature's lessons for building sustainable landscapes. So we'll go ahead and just dive into this. I want to start with this graphic. This is something I came across this place in Carmel River, by a poet, Robinson Jeffers, who was busy in the 1950s and 60s writing on environmental and social justice through poetry. And while he was doing that, he built this place out of stone. And he had a wonderful analogy, which was poetry is nothing more than the stacking of words. So there's an obvious analogy here to stacking stones to build a tower. This is his tour house. And we're going to draw on this to talk about how in economies and in ecosystems, we stack other things. Challenges in our economies is we really have not understood what the things are that must be stacked to build a sustainable economy. So my work over the past 30 years has not just been ecological restoration, understanding and acting to restore damaged ecosystems, but an interest of mine has been to really dig into what is that structure of a sustainable economy, and how do we, if we understand what that structure is, how do we restore that or build that structure? So three little things or simple things we're going to discuss today. Usually this is a 45-minute or a 1-hour talk. We're going to try to do this in a half an hour, so I'll do my best. Ken, you're going to keep me on time, keep me honest?
I'll try, but you have a lot of freedom.
Okay. Is there someone else who'd be going on after this, or more time you need to dedicate to something else? No. Okay.
Nope.
Well, I'll still try to keep it as brief as possible. So three things. What is that archetype or that model of a sustainable economic landscape? What is the power of diversity? And if we know what that is, what are the threats to diversity from an economic standpoint and an ecological standpoint? And again, through the understanding of structure, can we take guidance or lessons from ecological restoration and apply those lessons to restoring our economies? So three things. And let's get started with this idea of stacking bricks. Studied ecology or biology in the past, this is going to look familiar to you, where at the very bottom of this pyramid, our primary production is our vegetation, even mosses, algae, things like that, that are capable of taking limited solar energy and converting it into biological energy. That energy then is available to be transferred throughout the system. Functional groups of fungi, bacteria, detritivores who can take the residue of the entire system and return it back actually into the energy cycle and biomass pyramid. Stacked on top of this, we have primary consumers like insects. Stacked on top of that are secondary consumers that eat those insects. On top of that, we might have some like a snake that eats frog, all the way up to our top predators. Now, The important part of this is that the system is about 99% endogenous. And we're starting to hear economists actually start about endogenous systems, which is great. And conservationists thinking about endogenous systems. And what that means is the biochemical energy, what we refer to as primary energy in our economies, is created and cycled within the system right here in a region, for instance, or a forest or a meadow. Very little of that energy is transferred, that usable energy, that biochemical energy, very little is transferred to other landscapes. So our economies are equally stacked, where at the base we have resource extraction like agriculture, logging, energy, metal recycling, etc. And stacked on top of that is manufacturing. Services and IT are stacked on top of that. However, our economies, as I think most of you understand, are not anywhere near endogenous. You know, most of the energy in the system is transferred into it from many, it can be thousands of miles away. But also, when you think about fossil fuels, which is 80% of the energy of our economies, it was transferred into our economies from extinct ecosystems that produced that energy 300 million years ago. So we would call this an exogenous system based on transfers into the system from another homologous system, like an ecosystem or from another economy. So we have these other forms of resource transfers, or this capital and biomass transfer in our economies. That's foreign trade and something called the carry trade, which today we call it the carry trade. A long time ago, we called it the carrying trade, economists did. And it gets into the realm of global market currency exchanges, betting on markets, variable in the New York Stock Exchange, etc. The things, the mechanisms that allow foreign trade and other trade to occur across countries. So what, right? What we have this similar, we could have a similar kind of a stacking of businesses and industries on top of one another to form sectors that form a domestic economy all the way up into the global market economy. Well, Adam Smith, noted by many to be the father of kind of traditional economics, had this to say about the structure of our economy, that the carrying and foreign trades, they are a reflection. They're not a cause of the wealth of a nation, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. So in other words, in an ecosystem, we might say that the top predators, any consumers, they could only exist to the extent that what we call the trophic level or the producer consumer level below it, those top predators, any predator could only exist to the extent that the level below it is highly productive. And in fact, what we see is a great reduction in energy and biomass at every level of the pyramid, so that the amount of biomass in, say, the top predators in the Serengeti is a fraction of what's at the base, what's at the bottom. So this is what we see today. This image of a balloon in the U.S. U.S. economy with regards to trade. But we see it in other economies too, in Germany, Sri Lanka, India, Brazil, England, on and on and on. Nations and economies tied to the global marketplace, where the top of the balloon is filled more and more with carrying and foreign trades. Services, government technology in the United States forms about 66% of our domestic GDP. Manufacturing, 10%. Agriculture, 1%. So this is a fairly thin, one might say tenuous position for any economy to find themselves in. At the bottom, you can see my cursor here. Obviously, we have this symbol of energy, exogenous energy, pumped into the balloon to keep it aloft. Right? Energy is one of those foundational components of our economies. So over the same time period, we really saw this shift in the United States, actually, and in Sri Lanka, starting in the 80s, following what is referred to as a system of, or a whole mass of laws known as the Washington Consensus that liberated trade further across the country. Ever since then, we've seen an erosion of our manufacturing and extractive industries, which produce 7.5 indirect jobs for every direct job. So we relieved a lot of that pressure versus our retail and service industries that create only about 1.5 or 1.6 jobs for every direct job. So the amount of jobs demanded by our modern economy relative to our total GDP is a lot less with the current structure. So a few painful symptoms. We're not going to dwell on these things too much. I think you all have your own lists that you could write down of the challenges we face in these modern economies. But two of them I do want to point out today is that according to the World Health Organization and the Food and Agricultural Organization came out with a report a few years ago that said about a quarter of humans globally are suffering from moderate to severe food insecurity. If you do the math, that's about 2 billion humans. And for perspective, the number of humans on Earth prior to the Green Revolution, the 60s, was 2 billion. So we have to really question, how much progress we've made with this global trade model, with the balloon that we formed in some of our economies. In the U.S., productivity growth has actually stagnated since the 1970s. There's a little blip in the late 90s, which a lot of economists still have a hard time understanding as to why, but relatively flat since the 70s. So one more slide here on economics before we really dive into hopefully something a little more interesting. I think just about everybody on the call today is familiar with this phrase GDP, gross domestic product, right? It's a sum of all goods and services produced in a country in a given year. The US is at the top, right? Last I checked, I believe it was somewhere around $27 trillion as of fourth quarter 2024, 2023. So, but there's this idea that I like to joke about, which is GEP, and none of you have heard about that because I've made this up. This is a gross exaggeration of productivity. And for example, I have two quick examples here. When we consider the amount of energy the United States consumes to support our GDP, and we look at GDP per capita, and we could rank this. And so I've gone through this exercise in my book, and in the next edition of the book, I have a table. I've got data for about, 75, 80 countries. The America ranks about 65th in terms of its ability to sustain its populace with energy, right? So there's another example I want to use there, and this is corn. This is a field of corn in northeast Nebraska, where my wife's family is from. Sea to shining sea, wonderful, highly productive systems. And when we look at natural systems, for instance, tall grass prairie that existed before this, we don't think in terms of the gross productivity of the system, but we think in terms of the net productivity, because the system has to maintain itself, to be self-regulating, to thrive over the course of eons. But we'll look at this system, and we start digging into thinking about this idea of net productivity as a system in need of. When we look at the soils, the latest data from our Corn Belt, about 33 million acres of the U.S. Corn Belt gone. So what this translates to is if we look at one conventional means to restore that degradation, it would be adding organic matter, say compost, back into the system. And when I calculated a fraction of that with the tools I have available, and we asked, well, how much money would that cost to do? It's about $1.1 trillion. So that expense was not accounted for in the years that the productivity of these cornfields contributed to our GDP. So it's exaggeration, right? Now we could add on top of that a lot of other costs. In 2021 alone, the U.S. spent $670 billion on cleaning up toxic spills from different activities around the globe. We got the Chesapeake Bay. We have a lot of ecological restoration that happens into the trillions, perhaps every year. So these are costs. They're maintenance of the system that we do not account for in our productivity. So when we look at net domestic production and productive capacity, this is basically looking at what I would call true production, which is the way I believe we should look at our economies to reflect the degradation of the system if it's not operating well. Our productive capacity is our ability to produce now and in the future. So this cornfield has a lower productive capacity and a lower net domestic production than it may look like. Now, importantly, from a conservation standpoint and from even a profitability standpoint, net domestic production and productive capacity, they increase when we use resources more efficiently. So what can our economies learn from our ecosystems? This is Dr. Simon Johnson. He gave a talk at the American Economics Association in 2007, a keynote address to the entire room, and lambasting the current system for producing all sorts of externalities and social and environmental challenges, things that the collective field of economics has failed to address. And Dr. Johnson used an interesting analogy. He said that, we did not know how to repair our most basic health and human well-being concerns until we understood the germ theory of disease. That is, we understand enough about the cells in our bodies, the organization of our organ systems, and things like that, so that we can repair our bodies when they break down, and even develop a vaccine to a novel virus like COVID. So it's a great analogy, but here's where it breaks down is with population, our knowledge of those foundational components that we must understand that break down. Now, lo and behold, we have multiple species that form communities, and multiple communities of animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, different kingdoms of life that form an ecosystem. Our knowledge of those foundational components, the organs of the system, if you will, they break down considerably. What we do see is this increasing complexity of our ecosystems, such that here in Colorado, where I am right now, 300 million years ago, was a tropical system. And as Pangea broke up and North America was drifting northward, amazing change was unleashed upon the system. The rise of the Himalayas, vacillations in oxygen amounts, rising temperatures, ice ages, the evolution of human beings, etc. Native Americans, indigenous peoples migrated to North America and really also started having an effect, a positive effect in a lot of ways on our systems. And all that happened is that we converted our ecosystems. They changed, they morphed from a tropical system into a temperate system. That's all. That's complexity really allows them to persist over time, more so than an individual cell. Now we see the same nested structure in our economies of humans forming businesses, businesses nested within industries, industries within sectors, and sectors that comprise our economies. So we have this complexity that makes our ecosystems and our economies homologous, similar structure. Now, this word homologous too, back to Simon Johnson's analogy, also says, well, in humans, part of what we looked at to help resolve things like understanding how vaccines work in our body was to study homologous systems such as other primates and other mammals. We study those to better understand our own system. So there are three components I wanted to focus on today. We're going to touch on them briefly only, because I want to spend enough time to talk about, with this knowledge, how might we approach restoration of our economies integrated with ecological restoration at a landscape scale. But three of these are diversity, energy, and trade. And that's squishy, right? We can't really touch diversity. The idea of diversity, it's a thing, it comprises thousands of individuals. Energy, yeah, it's hard to touch energy too, this concept of energy. And trade, what is that? So this is squishy. It's not like the organs of our body, right? But we can understand that because when you consider these highly complex systems are composed of so many billions, perhaps, of individuals, we can imagine that something as simple as one human being or one species does not comprise a foundational component. These components are a little bit more nebulous. What we typically focus on, however, in sustainability is this idea of the social, the environmental, and industrial or economic context. And so, in other words, I've been working really fortunate to be working with Pueblo, Colorado, some folks down there in the food industry, and helping think about economic restoration. So an example, Pueblo, Colorado, their culture, that social context, is that they have an Italian, Mexican, Slovak heritage. They're very hardworking, very friendly and welcoming, I can attest. And there's great pride of community. Those sorts of variables define your social context. Your environmental context is it's in the Arkansas River watershed drainage. In Colorado on the Arkansas, it is extremely dry. Water scarcity is a problem. It's a challenge. And there's a lot of sunshine. There's a high elevation. The industrial context is a history of steel production and a great food culture, a lot of food production. So the social, environmental, industrial context, this is very important when we think about approaching not just ecological restoration, but definitely economic restoration, because every social, environmental, industrial context is like the miracle or a fingerprint, right? And it's unique. Every fingerprint's unique, so that when you look at the globe, even a nation, it's composed of thousands of unique fingerprints. And it's a way, hopefully, that we can think about how carefully we must approach economic restoration in our communities. There'll be a chance pretty shortly here for any questions you might have, and then again at the end. But I'll go ahead. Well, we could stop now, I guess. And Ken, if you want to check the chat, or if anyone has a question, please post it to Ken. Or Ken, if you're okay, we could also just have folks just speak up if they got questions.
Yeah, feel free to speak up, anyone, or just chime in. There's nothing on the chat in the moment.
Okay, great. So if there is, yeah, please put it in the chat. Next, we're going to talk about the power of diversity. And it's commonplace. Obviously, we as human beings, we always feel like we're at the center of the universe. So when we think about diversity, we think about human diversity. And that's not a bad thing. But when I speak about diversity in ecological context, I'm thinking about the great diversity of life that goes far beyond human beings. Diversity is operating continually in our ecosystems in a way that as a human, you could ride down a river through a riparian area or in an estuary or walk through the forest and not even realize that disturbance is happening because the forest looks completely healthy all the time to us, unless there's some catastrophic change. There's always disturbances happening. We don't realize it. The miracle of diversity. So, a fun exercise I had over the past 10 years is looking at the different forms of diversity that actually exist in our ecosystems. And again, well, if our economies are homologous, same structure and functions, we should see the same forms of diversity in our economies. And lo and behold, we actually do. And what really helped to define that was to ask the question, well, if species are the basic unit of measure for our diversity, as we just measure the number of species, what are we measuring in economic diversity? And that is the business. Okay, so when we get over that hurdle, we can really start understanding how complex diversity is and how we can measure this in a way that allows us to understand the impacts of diversity on things like job stability, wage growth, profitability, economic stability, etc. So, if you're interested in the book, or I could send you an article on diversity, there's a lot to talk about. I'm just going to cover two, though, really quickly here. And one of them is richness. And that is wherever you live right now, we think about drawing a 1 mile radius around your building or your house. And if you were to walk that entire area and count every single species that you encountered, you would end up with a number of total species, which is richness. This idea of richness is, I think, is great, actually, when we think about this fundamental aspect of diversity. It kind of indicates this idea of wealth, in a sense, and there's a lot of truth to that, this richness. There's this idea of functional redundancy, however, as well. And so I'm going to use these two birds here as an example. These are honey creepers. They're in the tanager family. They live in tropical areas. They eat berries and they sip nectar from flowers, right? And if one of these goes extinct, or if there's a population crash or something, there are several other species of honey creepers and other tanagers who fill a similar niche. So thank goodness. And this is a really hidden gem, or one of the reasons that the complexity of ecosystems contribute to great resistance and stability over time, is this idea of functional redundancy. Now, we see this in our economies as well. I'm going to use an example of a place in far northern California called Belcampo Meats, where a lot of my family has lived over the years. Belcampo was known for grass-finished, organic, free-range meat products that were so incredible that they had a price tag to them such that I never saw them when I went shopping. But fortunately, I had a brother there who worked there, and so we were able to get some discounts over the time. But important part of this is that I should back up. One day, in one Bel Campo plant, one person made one mistake. And the very next week, my brother got a call, and the company shut its doors, and he was out of a job. But fortunately, there was another similar company in Siskiyou County, California, what some might know as the state of Jefferson. And so there's a little bit of functional redundancy, and this guy here got another job within the next week, thanks to that functional redundancy. Okay, enough about that. And you can ask the question, well, so what? So what about diversity? We should ask that about everything, right? So what? Well, it wouldn't matter except for these benefits, these really unsung benefits, these great benefits of diversity that we never hear about in, I don't think, pop culture or in the news or coming out of any politician's mouth, perhaps. And one of those that we see again in the ecosystems and economies is that diversity, when it increases, we increase resistance and resilience. Those two things, resistance and resilience, combined in this idea of stability, relative stability over time. That is a great, one great benefit. Another one, which is odd to think about, is a higher net productivity just from diversity. Now, a stranger one that's hard to believe is this idea of a more efficient use of energy from diversity. Higher wages, employment, and profitability, and a more even distribution of wealth or biomass from diversity. Now, and these come from economic studies and ecological studies. And one of them, though, I do not see in the research is greater human fulfillment. And we can imagine, this is just a guess of mine, maybe one of yours too, that a very homogenized single sector economy does not provide for great fulfillment of human beings in that economy. So diversity of industry and business provides for greater ability for humans to find fulfillment in their economy, ways that serve their communities. So how is a diverse economy, how is it more energy efficient? Well, we'll start by looking at ecosystems. So, this is an image of what's called photosynthetically active radiation, PAR, right? And the red areas, the tropics on the equator, have very high PAR. And this drives the ability of vegetation to create biological or biochemical energy for the entire system. And it decreases as we go the poles. So this arrow here, this is Wisconsin, southeast Wisconsin, actually, where I was able to meet with some friends of friends who have a tall grass prairie restoration project right here. And now we have multiple species of tall grass species here. That was a little redundant. Multiple different tall grass species here that are used in this restoration project. And because we have dozens of different species, they all have a different means of acquiring resources in the same space. So that over the course of one day, the system can harness more energy that is fixed, right? That solar energy falling on the earth is fixed amount in every location on the earth, as you saw in that graph. And so with that fixed energy, this diverse community can actually sequester more of it and convert it into biochemical energy. Now, it's not just in one space in one day, but over the course of one season, different species have some productivity, such that over the course of a year, come and go in their populations. The system has this balance that allows it to always, regardless of insect outbreaks, droughts, etc., to produce as much energy as possible with that diversity. So what, right? Well, in our ecological systems, it turns out that the more energy, exogenous energy we transfer into the system, and again, that is from some other, not from the sun, but from some other homologous system, our economies perhaps. We see consistently a decrease in biodiversity. This is from about 200 studies across the globe in multiple contexts, where the form of energy is actually, it's nitrogen, ammonium nitrate, convenient form of applying biochemical energy that is essential to life in experimental fashion. We see this again, 200 studies across the globe, consistently a decline in biological diversity when we transfer energy to the system. So do we see a similar pattern in our ecosystem? Something we can learn from that. So this is looking at energy in the United States since 1776, since our founding through 2019. The blue is clearly exogenous petroleum, natural gas, coal. And some of the green there is also exogenous, transferred into an economy from an adjacent economy. Or, in the case of fossil fuels, 300 million years ago from an extinct ecosystem, buried, unearthed, and transferred into our economy. So we just see this tremendous increase. So back to northeastern Nebraska, the glowing green cornfield. There was the Oakdale grain mill that provided great value add to farmers. There was a very, very diverse economy back in the late 1800s. But that went extinct as we see this transfer of energy starting about the 1930s. Fortunately, there was a nearby energy grain mill in nearby Neely. It was bigger. It survived for a little while until the 1950s. When I was on an economic research trip through the Midwest, I came across this great size mill, which you've seen these all across the country, that was big enough, you would think, to handle our grain mill needs, right, and provide some value added to the Midwest. This went extinct in 2019. I had nothing to do with it. It's a coincidence. I happened to walk up at the time this went extinct. And we've seen this great, it's not just with grain mills, but there's been this great economic extinction event. 300,000 bakeries lost over the same lost across in total across the U.S. 5 million farms wiped off the face of the earth as we've transferred energy into our economies. So I debate in the book, if energy really is the core culprit of this economic extinction event, or if there's something else. We're not going to go into that now, but if you're interested, we could talk about that later, such as technology. Trade, we'll talk about trade just briefly. Again, our ecosystem, that pyramid, if you remember that, is 100, almost 99, almost 100% endogenous, right? The resources that are cycled through the system are produced by that system, the biological resources. So, I calculated from some data, how much we actually import to the U.S. economy through foreign trade, and it's 60%. So, but let's track this a little bit and go, well, whatever state you're living in, if we look at Colorado and we ask, well, okay, if 60% of what's imported, what we consume is imported to our nation, think that Colorado is also importing products from other states. So we have to add those increases to that 60%. So actually we have an increased amount that we actually import to Colorado. I think about where I live in Fort Collins, we're importing products not just from other states in other countries, but from other counties and other cities in Colorado. So that percentage increases more. And, as an example, it's somewhere over 90% likely. And I presented this to audiences actually all over the world now. And definitely in many, many states across the nation. And most folks agree, yeah, about 99% of what we consume as individuals, as the number of products is imported. This is completely upside down from how trade works or resource transfers work in our ecosystems. In other words, any center of production, an ecosystem here on the Prudhoe River in Colorado, or the shortgrass prairie just in eastern Malheur County where I live, you go there, and as the farther you get away from that system, the less likely you are to find evidence of that production in another system. It decreases with distance. Okay. Any questions about that? That was a really quick walk through what is a little bit complex about the foundational components of our economies. So, yeah, if there are any questions, I'm happy to field a few of those. Feel free to belt them out, or Ken, if you want to facilitate that, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll move on. There'll be one more chance at the end too if folks are interested to dive into some of these. And thanks for your patience. I know you may not study economics in your daily life, but we'll see how this might actually filter its way in, this approach to sustainable economics or economic restoration, how it might apply to, for instance, how we approach watershed restoration or even large-scale floodplain restoration. So to understand that, it's helpful, we as a restoration ecologists, we use disturbance as a guide to how we restore a system. Fire is a very typical one in Colorado and other places in the arid West that has been on the increase. And so this idea of ecological succession is just a change in the plant community over time in response to a disturbance. Fire is a good one. Let's say a catastrophic fire, like our Hyde Park fire or a Cameron Peak fire, blows through and resets the system to zero. There is this process of time on this x-axis that in the early stages, there's almost nothing growing. But over time, right, nature has a way of repairing itself. We're starting to see an increase in the vegetation on the ground. Until, if there is no other disturbance, no fires, no insect outbreaks, no large windstorms, if we were able to actually keep disturbance at bay long enough, then we would see what we call a climax community or a late successional community that is the dense green forest again. And again, so what? Right now on this y-axis, we're going to look at net productivity and diversity, ecological diversity. We'll ask a question. See my cursor here. You ask the question, does productivity and diversity, is it just linear and it's ever increasing from these early days after a fire and slowly it just increases and there's a maximum on the top right here in the late successional stage? Or is it some other form of curve? And from, again, data from all over the world and our ecological systems, there's more of this one-humped camel, right? Where there's actually a peak of productivity and diversity in the middle. And I should clarify, this is for terrestrial systems. We don't always see this in marine systems, for instance, or other aquatic systems. And, you know, the peak in the middle is approximate, right? Depends a little bit on the ecosystem in question. But it's interesting that it's not in the far right side of the scale, of the successional scale. But we're going to look at another curve here, and trust me, this will apply to our economic systems and really get us thinking about how to approach restoration. And that is biomass accumulation. What's happening with the accumulation of biomass over time? And there's a different curve here. This red dotted line where there's a threshold cross, which is if we keep disturbance at bay, and we've done this with fire suppression, for instance, in our watersheds, we see that biomass accumulation increases rapidly and it starts to slow down. It slows down because these later successional communities are not as productive. We cross a threshold between increasing and then flattening biomass accumulation and decreasing diversity and decreasing productivity growth. And so we can think about this as perhaps the ecological explanation of the wealth gap, right? In our modern economies, we do a lot of things to keep very large scale businesses in operation, especially at the bottom end of the pyramid, right? The extractive and manufacturing sectors. And we've experienced this great concentration of wealth into fewer businesses or fewer individuals, and productivity growth has been flat, et cetera. So we do see these parallels, and this is an interesting way to think about our economies, that perhaps, again, that economic diversity and productivity and energy efficiency are somehow interconnected. This is a facility in northern Arizona. Restoration Forest Products had a chance to spend a day with them to look at their operation. Not only did they produce timber from trees in a ponderosa pine system that has had great fire suppression for decades like we have here in Colorado, but they also produce energy biomass from this in a nearby plant. And not only that, but they actually increase the understory productivity of grasses that can provide fodder for grazing animals, et cetera. So, you know, this is one example of a restoration action that has watershed benefits, but also economic benefits in the same area. So where do we focus our economic restoration? What might this all boil down to? What might Robinson Jeffers say about stacking blocks or stacking words? Is that we start at the bottom, right? Our extractive industries, we rebuild the foundation of our economies where our productive labor provides upward pressure on job creation and a strong, stable foundation, irregardless of what's happening in the global marketplace. So a few things in terms of what does that look like in agricultural industries, including what might happen in our watersheds or in a floodplain, is focusing on restoring crop diversity. There's a lot of studies out there that show this crop diversity adds profitability to farmers compared to current monoculture farming. More perennial plants rebuild without having to till the land every year. This idea of regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture rebuilds organic matter in the soil while minimizing inputs. And adding animals to the system is another way to add minor disturbances that increase productivity of these perennial systems, such as a prairie. Again, these things rebuild soil organic matter so that you minimize inputs. And some of those studies on the profits in diverse farming systems, one of the reasons for that profit is because they're minimizing the amount of inputs because there's more organic matter in the soil. We can talk about that more later if you're interested in terms of like the biological mechanisms behind that. There's a little bit of interesting work going on behind the scenes. But when we think about carbon on the globe and their current concerns about carbon and our economic landscape, so to speak, know that 80%, that's a huge number, 80% of carbon is actually stored in the soils. And so the potential for agricultural systems through restoration to build carbon sinks might be one of the most greatest nodes of opportunity into resolving some of our carbon challenges. So I had the distinct pleasure to go visit Sri Lanka after they experienced an economic collapse, balloon, so to speak, if you remember that shape, of a lot of inputs of energy and some other challenges, and meet with some economics professors there, farmers, business folks, etc. And we're going to just talk about a few things that they're doing that get to this idea of an endogenous economy. And one of those is they have 5 means of producing nitrogen fertilizer on farm. We'll talk about them all, but Mexican sunflower is one of those where this fixes nitrogen just like alfalfa would in a farm, but grows in midst other plants to naturally nourish those plants. Another one, and some of these things could be replicated in southern parts of the United States where climate is appropriate, where the environmental context is appropriate. There's this azolla. It is a water fern that fixes nitrogen via a symbiotic relationship with cyanobacterium, produces lots of nitrogen. Sri Lankan farmers are also using chicken manure and other things, but also making their own insecticides naturally from different plants, neem seeds, for instance. Now, Sewa, the gentleman in the orange shirt there, came to Baltimore last fall. I don't know if you had a chance to meet him. He's walked the fields of a friend of his in the burgundy shirt there. And they're now, instead of importing nitrogen, they're using chicken manure from Sri Lanka to grow their crops. And it's actually cheaper now than imported nitrogen. And it's an endogenous resource. But this gentleman is also experimenting by diversifying the understory of these coir or these palm groves to diversify that income base, and actually do with the same amount of sun falling on the earth here to produce more products with that limited solar radiation. So yeah, agricultural restoration and other extractive industries are at the bottom, and as we stack our bricks here into the manufacturing industry, there's also a relationship to food. I'm going to talk about that briefly. I have an entire chapter on basically the different mechanisms, not just from nature, but from other folks around the globe that allow us to produce maybe not 5 million products for the globe, 5 million units of one product for the globe, but how to retool manufacturing to produce dozens of products out of one facility for our region. In doing so, we're going to talk about one other example from Salinas de Guaranda, Ecuador. It's up in the high Andes. Had a chance to meet with some of those folks during a restoration project down there just to the north of that place through Engineers Without Borders and through AloTerra. And this is a wonderful story I just wanted to share quickly here, but it starts in a place in the 1970s where Salinas, which refers to salt, it was a salt mine. Throughout the Andes, a very important salt mine, but one of those places where half of the children under age 5 did not survive. There was some agriculture going on, as you can see in the hills in this picture here, but a lot of those products were just directly exported out of the community. So there's a gentleman here, an Italian priest who worked with a few others in a pretty successful project to do some things to change the economic fate, to restore the economy of Salinas de Guaranda in a region. This is Salinas today, and it is completely changed. And this is the son of the person that was in that original photo. And if there's any better example, perhaps, of the power of economic restoration to benefit communities, this is it in my mind. But what specifically? I had a chance to meet with some of the folks there in their cooperatives, spend a few days, and really try to understand a few keys to their economic success. One of them is clearly visible in this photo, and they now have 250 products that they sell out of Salinas de Guaranda in their watershed. They now have 2 participating watersheds, and so it's pretty wonderful. Yeah, over 250 products. So this is economic diversity. Entrepreneurship is another one. I've heard stories from other folks I've worked with in Ecuador of the Italian priest, um, Paulo is his name, pounding the pulpit literally in the church in the town square, saying, "You must start businesses, and nothing shall leave the economy unfinished." Literally pounding the pulpit, saying that we must have value added. As a result, the amount of money that the agricultural community was receiving for its products, such as milk or pork, increased tremendously because they were, instead of selling it to a regional distributor, they're actually making additional value-added products such as salami and cheese, and that had a greater value that translated to more money on the ground to the farmers. So pretty wonderful. One of the mechanisms behind why this works is this idea of recirculation value of money. Through several studies in the United States, what we find is that for every $20 you spend at chain stores, for instance, only $3 stays in your local economy. But when you spend that $20 at a local business, $10 stays in your local economy. And there's a gap there still of $10, right? That's missing, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that most of what we consume in our local businesses actually is not from our local areas. So I don't want to spend too much time on this to say that from a legislative standpoint, part of what I'm trying to and we've been learning from others around the U.S. and other parts of the globe is the different ways in which we can actually enact legislation and manage cooperation of cities and counties and states to restore our economies at a regional level through these multi-jurisdictional compacts, such as the Colorado River Compact and in Colorado here, the Science, Culture, and Facilities district tax, and other things. Vermont, however, is a great example. They have a system of codes and a very strong, I would call it, an endogenous energy economy. And together, these things that favor small business production and regional consumption have really had tremendous impacts on Vermont. And there's a variety of different sales tax initiatives, things that again that governments can do. But if we look at Vermont, we look at again that ranking, the per capita GDP relative to energy consumption. Here's the top 10 in the world as of 2021: Luxembourg, Iceland, Cyprus, Ireland, etc. Vermont is actually, if it was its own country, actually ranks number 2. So pretty amazing what they've accomplished. Doesn't mean that Vermont's perfect, right, or any other country, but from this standpoint, they're doing pretty well. So what this means is if we're looking at a watershed anywhere on Earth, anywhere in the U.S., or a large riparian floodplain, any large regional project, where do we start? We start with an economic restoration analysis, and this goes back to that context, right, where we look at what are the social and cultural values of the region. We have to start there. We shall not, and this is one of the reasons why I think the Salinas de Guaranda project was so successful. Is yes, there was some outside influence, but they started with understanding what the current social and cultural climate was like and what the potential there was, such as how people value the economic system, food and clothing preferences, desired governance models. They use a cooperative model, not a tax model, to develop their economy. Views in technology, graft, corruption, etc. Those are all social and cultural factors that have to be considered in an analysis. Obviously, there's an environmental context. What is the agricultural potential? What sort of extractive resources are available? What are some of the natural environmental constraints and opportunities that would guide or indicate what some of the economic restoration potential is in any watershed or any flood? Then there's the industrial context, such as understanding the history and the current state of extractive and manufacturing capacity, technology and labor, that is a skill of labor, experience, desires, etc., even working desires, right? How many days a week do people like to work, right? All these things kind of factor into the industrial context and others. So we go through this economic restoration analysis, and you have to start there to understand how we approach ecological restoration and how that restoration can be used as a tool to restore economic well-being for a region. So what that translates to, I believe, and as the planners in Salinas did on to believe, is that there's boundless opportunities for entrepreneurs, investors, inventors, and investors, right? And it depends on that social, environmental, industrial context, such as, is selective logging for wood, energy, and animal products. Is that possible in your watershed? What is the role of regenerative agriculture and its allies, such as sustainable agriculture? How do you build a strong regional marketplace? There are hundreds and hundreds of products that we use in economics, this age-old idea of import substitution, which is, anything that you're currently importing that you can make yourselves, you simply substitute that import with something made locally. That's import substitution. When you think about the vast quantity of what we do consume regionally that is imported, the opportunity for entrepreneurship to restore the diversity of our economies regionally is incredible. So all of this is underscored, however, I believe, by water and energy sovereignty. There's a lot of movement in a lot of communities around the United States and in other regions of the world where regions and communities are seeing their water disappear. It's going out of their community, and they're also seeing their energy disappear, going out of their community through power purchase agreements, for instance, for large wind and solar fields. Without electricity, it can be cabled all across the country, and they don't have control over that energy. So because energy and water really underlies the health and the sovereignty of all of our communities, these are basic things that must happen to ensure a stable, resilient, productive economy for people at the base of the pyramid all across the world. That's all I've got. I want to thank you guys for your time. If you're interested in the book or working with economic restoration, I'm always happy to work with folks who have a desire to look not at just ecological restoration for the sake of ecosystems, but how we can make these subtle tweaks to make ecological restoration work in favor of people in the areas being impacted. Well, thanks a bunch. I appreciate your time. If there are any questions, we can take them now, or Ken, maybe you've got some other things you want to talk about today.
Oh, we can take questions now. Oh,
yeah, we can take questions now. Thank you very much, John.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And if you're interested, John's book, Ecosystems as Models for Restoring Our Economies, is available on Amazon. But yeah, floor's open for discussion. We keep it open for a few minutes. It's very interesting. I hope some people will chime in. But we have people. Oh, we have a bunch of people dropped off already.
On any? That's okay.
Yeah.
It's the lunch hour. Is anyone working on any projects that can incorporate economic restoration into their ecological restoration?
Yeah, John, we have a project that we want to share with you that we'll be meeting on tomorrow with Mayor in Eudora, Arkansas. So we'll be sharing some more things with you in the future. I'm really excited about kind of some things we can do in southeast Arkansas. So
great. Well, thanks everybody.
Yeah,
appreciate the time.
Thanks everybody.
Yeah, and John, you missed the eclipse. Go outside quick.
Oh yeah. Oh, is that why it got dark all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's
why I was looking at outside too. All right, go look at the eclipse and don't stare at it.
All right, take care, everybody.
All right, bye everyone.